My name is Clara Ashworth and I am 34 years old. 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, I was cleaning out her bedroom when I moved the mirror she'd kept on her dresser for as long as I could remember. It was an old mirror. Heavy, oval, with a wooden frame she'd painted white sometime in the 90s. It had hung on that wall my entire life. I'd looked into it 1,000 times, getting ready for school, trying on her jewelry when she wasn't home, standing beside her while she braided my hair on Sunday mornings. Behind that mirror, taped flat against the wall, was an envelope. Yellow with age. My name written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. For Claire. To be opened when she is ready. I stood in my mother's empty bedroom holding that envelope for a long time. My father had left before I was born. That's what my mother had always told me. He left, he didn't want us, end of story. She said it so cleanly, so finally, that I'd learned before I was 10 years old not to ask again. I'd spent 34 years believing my father was a man who walked away from his daughter without looking back. The letter in my hands was dated 3 weeks before my birth. And by the time I finished reading it, everything I thought I knew about my own life had turned to dust. Please like and subscribe before we go any further. But only if this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest. Drop your location in the comments. Tell me where you are and what time it is. I want to know you're there. Let me take you back to the beginning. The real beginning. My mother, Diane Ashworth, was not an easy woman to know. I say that with love. The complicated kind. The kind that takes years to develop and even longer to say out loud without guilt attached to it. She was beautiful in the way of old photographs. The kind of beauty that's specific to a particular era. All dark eyes and sharp cheekbones and a quality of stillness that could read as either calm or distance depending on the day. She kept her home immaculate. She cooked well. She showed up to every school event, every recital, every parent-teacher conference, punctual and well-dressed and attentive in the way that looked from the outside like a complete picture of motherhood. She just never talked about anything real. Not about herself. Not about her past. Not about the years before I existed that had shaped everything about the woman who raised me. When I was small, I thought this was normal. When I was older, I understood it was a choice. She'd moved us to a small town in Vermont when I was 2. Before that, we'd lived in Boston, or so she told me. She never explained the move. When I asked about Boston, she'd say simply that it was time for a change, and the finality in her voice made the question feel like a door I wasn't supposed to open. I grew up in a house where certain topics had the quality of locked rooms. My father was the most locked of all. What I knew, his name was James. They'd been together briefly. He left when she found out she was pregnant. She'd raised me alone and hadn't heard from him since. What she said when I pushed for more. Some people aren't meant to stay. It's better not to dwell. I stopped asking by the time I was 12. Not because I'd stopped wanting to know. But because every time I asked, my mother's face did something that I couldn't stand to cause. Not anger. Something more internal than anger. Something that looked like pain she'd learned to carry so long she'd almost stopped noticing it. I didn't want to make her carry it more visibly. So I let the locked room stay locked. And I built my life around the absence at its center. The way you learn to walk around a piece of furniture that's always been in the same place. You stop seeing it after a while. You just know to go around. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 18 months before she died. She told me on a Sunday afternoon in October, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea she'd already made before she called me to come over, as if she needed the ritual of the tea to get through the telling. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I sat down across from her. The familiar kitchen. The familiar table. The white curtains she'd hung 20 years ago and never replaced. She told me clearly, factually, the way she did most things. The diagnosis. The stage. The options the doctors had outlined. She'd already had consultations. She had a plan. "Mom," I said, "let me finish." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've thought about this carefully. I want to do the treatment. I'm not giving up. But I want you to understand what we might be facing." He said we. That was the moment I understood how serious it was. My mother did not say we unless she meant it. I moved back to Vermont 3 weeks later. Got a remote work arrangement with the architecture firm where I'd been working for 6 years. Converted her spare room into an office and learned, over the following months, the particular intimacy of caring for a parent. The schedules, the medications, the appointments, the hours in waiting rooms, the gradual narrowing of the world to the most essential things. We were closer in those 18 months than we'd been in my entire adult life. Not because we suddenly talked about the locked rooms. We didn't. She was still my mother, still careful, still inclined toward the practical over the personal. But there were evenings after dinner when she'd sit in her chair by the window and I'd sit on the floor with my back against the couch the way I had as a child, and we'd just be in the same space together without either of us needing to fill it. Those evenings were their own kind of conversation. Once, about 4 months before she died, she said something that I've turned over many times since. We were watching the snow fall outside the window. The lamp was on. The room was warm. I made choices, she said quietly, to no one in particular. I thought they were right at the time. I looked at her. Some of them were right, she said. Some of them I'm less sure about now. I waited to see if she'd say more. He didn't. He just watched the snow. I didn't ask. I wish now that I had. But I didn't want to disturb whatever she was sitting with. It seemed private in the way of things people work through alone, in the last chapters of their lives, when the accounting becomes necessary. She died on a Tuesday morning in February with me beside her and snow on the ground outside. The last thing she said to me the evening before was, "You've been a good daughter. Better than I deserved." I told her that wasn't true. She smiled in the way of someone who knows something you don't. I understand now what she meant. 3 weeks after the funeral, I began clearing out her bedroom. I'd been putting it off. The rest of the house I'd managed. The kitchen, the living room, the small study where she kept her books. But her bedroom felt different. More intimate. The space where a person is most themselves. And my mother had been so carefully guarded about herself that entering it felt like a trespass even now that she was gone. I started with the practical things. Clothes. The jewelry box on her dresser, which I went through slowly, setting aside the few pieces I wanted to keep. The mirror had always been above the dresser. Heavy oval white painted frame. She'd had it as long as I could remember. I'd assumed she'd brought it from Boston, though she'd never said so. I was going to leave it on the wall. But when I moved the dresser slightly to clean behind it, I noticed the mirror shift, and when I looked at it more closely I saw that it wasn't wall-mounted properly. It was resting against the wall rather than fixed to it, held in place by the weight of the dresser. I lifted it carefully. It was heavier than I expected. I leaned it against the bed. And there, on the wall behind where it had hung, was an envelope. Taped flat. My name on the front in handwriting I'd never seen. For Claire. To be opened when she is ready. I stood very still. The handwriting was neat, slightly formal, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a different generation. The tape holding it to the wall had dried and yellowed with the paper. It had been there a long time. I peeled it from the wall carefully. Sat down on the edge of my mother's bed. The envelope was sealed. Whatever was inside was folded thickly, more than one page. I turned it over in my hands. For Claire. To be opened when she is ready. 34 years old, sitting in my dead mother's bedroom, holding a letter written before I existed. I opened it. The pages inside were 3 in total, handwritten on the same yellowed paper as the envelope. The date at the top was March 3rd, 3 weeks before my birth date. I will not read you every word. Some of it belongs only to me, but I will tell you what it said. His name was James Calloway. He was 26 years old when he wrote it. He and my mother had been together for 2 years. He had believed, until 6 weeks before the letter was written, that they were building a life together. He wrote, "Diane, I don't know if you'll ever let her read this. But I need to write it anyway because she deserves to know that she was wanted. From the moment you told me you were pregnant, she was wanted. I want you both to know that." He wrote that my mother's family had not approved of him. That her father, my grandfather, a man I'd known only as a distant formal presence who died when I was 7, had considered him unsuitable. Not enough money. Not the right background. Not what he'd planned for his daughter. He wrote that there had been an ultimatum. That my grandfather had told my mother she would be cut off completely, financially, familiarly, in every way, if she stayed with James. That my mother had been 24 years old, pregnant, with no income of her own, and had been faced with a choice that no one should have to make at 24 years old and pregnant. He wrote, "I don't blame her. I want to be clear about that. I don't blame her. She was alone and afraid and she chose survival. I understand that. But I need our daughter to know, when she's old enough to understand, that I did not leave. I was asked to go. And I went because I thought fighting would only make things harder for Diane and harder for you. I thought disappearing was the kind thing. He wrote that he'd tried to reach my mother after I was born. That the letters had been returned. That the phone number had been changed. That he'd eventually understood that the door was closed. He wrote, "I don't know what she'll tell you about me. I hope she tells you the truth. But if she doesn't, if you grow up thinking I walked away, I need you to know, I didn't. I thought about you every day. I thought about who you might become. I wrote your name in my journal the day your mother told me she was pregnant, and I never stopped writing it." The last paragraph. "If you ever want to find me, my mother's name is Ruth Calloway. She lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts. She knows about you. He has always known. He wanted to know you from the beginning. Whatever happened between your mother and me, you have a grandmother who loves you without ever having met you. That's real. That belongs to you. Whatever you decide to do with it, that's yours. I love you, Claire. I have loved you since before you were born. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry it happened this way. But please know, you were never, not for one single day, not wanted. Your father, James. I need to stop here. Because I need a moment, and I think you might too. If you're watching this and you grew up with a story about a parent that turned out to be more complicated than you were told, drop something in the comments. Anything. I just want to know you're there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Because what I did after I read that letter, and what I found, I still don't fully have words for. Type Clara in the comments if you're still with me. I sat on my mother's bed for a long time. The letter in my hands. The mirror leaning against the bed frame. The afternoon light moving across the floor the way it does in February, thin and pale and slanted. I didn't cry immediately. I've noticed that about the biggest moments, the ones that rearrange something fundamental. They don't always arrive with tears. Sometimes they arrive as a kind of stillness. As if your whole body needs a moment to process the new information before it knows what to feel about it. My father had not left. He had been sent away. And my mother, my careful, controlled, locked-room mother, had taped his letter behind a mirror and kept it for 34 years. Had kept it. Not destroyed it. Had it close. Behind something she looked at every day. I thought about what she'd said 4 months before she died. I made choices. Some of them I'm less sure about now. I thought about the way she'd smiled that last evening. "You've been a good daughter. Better than I deserved." She knew I would find it. She'd left it for me to find. Not directly, she hadn't handed it to me, hadn't told me it existed, hadn't added it to the list of things she wanted me to have. But she hadn't destroyed it either, and she'd had 34 years to do that. A woman as careful and deliberate as my mother does not keep something she means to hide forever. She left it where I would find it when I cleared out the room. She left it behind the mirror she looked into every morning for 3 decades. It was the most honest thing she ever said to me. I put the letter back in the envelope. I carried it to the kitchen and placed it on the table. I made tea I didn't drink. I stood at the window watching the dark settle over the snow-covered yard. My father's name was James Calloway. His mother's name was Ruth. She lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts. He had always known about me. I went to bed without making any decisions. But I already knew what I was going to do. I drove to Gloucester on a Saturday morning, 10 days after I found the letter. I'd spent those 10 days the way you spend time before a decision that can't be undone. Carefully, slowly, turning the thing over and over, examining it from every angle, making sure you understand what you're walking toward. I'd searched for James Calloway online. There were a few. I couldn't be certain which was my father. I found a Ruth Calloway in Gloucester. An older woman, retired, a small house near the water based on what I could piece together from public records. She would be in her late 70s now. I didn't call ahead. I know that probably seems strange. But I was afraid that if I called I would lose my nerve. And I was afraid that if I lost my nerve I would spend the rest of my life wondering. The drive from Vermont to Gloucester is about 3 hours. I stopped once for coffee. I spent most of the drive very quiet, watching the landscape change from mountains to coast, feeling something I couldn't name building steadily in my chest. The house was a small Cape Cod on a side street 2 blocks from the harbor. White siding, blue shutters, a bird feeder in the front yard that was busy with activity despite the cold. A car in the driveway which I told myself meant someone was home. I sat in my car for several minutes. Then I got out and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately. The woman standing in the doorway was small, white-haired, with dark eyes that were sharp and warm at the same time. She was wearing a cardigan and holding a dish towel, and she looked at me with an expression I was completely unprepared for. Not surprise. Recognition. "Oh," she said softly. "Just that one word. Mrs. Calloway?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. "My name is Clara Ashworth. I stopped. Started again. I found a letter." Ruth Calloway looked at me for a long moment. Then her eyes filled with tears. "I know who you are," she said. "I'd know you anywhere." She stepped back from the door. "Please come in. Please. I've been waiting for a very long time." She made tea. Of course she made tea. It seemed to be what people did in moments like this. Reached for the most ordinary ritual available as an anchor against the extraordinary. I sat at her kitchen table and looked around the room while she moved at the stove. Small house full of things. Books everywhere. Photographs on the walls and the shelves and propped on the counter. A lifetime's worth of accumulated living. She set a mug in front of me and sat down across the table. "How did you find me?" she asked. "The letter." I pulled it from my bag and placed it on the table between us. My mother hid it behind a mirror in her bedroom. "I found it when I was clearing out her things. She passed away 6 weeks ago." Ruth's expression shifted. "I heard," she said quietly. "James told me." I looked at her. "He knows she died?" "He has kept track of you," Ruth said carefully, from a distance. "The way he could. He never stopped." She paused. "He never stopped wanting to know you were all right." Something moved through my chest that I didn't have a word for yet. "Is he?" I stopped. Took a breath. "Is he alive?" Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "He's alive," she said. "He lives 20 minutes from here." She held my gaze. "He doesn't know you're here today. But I can call him." She paused. "If you want me to." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside I could hear the birds at the feeder. The distant sound of the harbor. 34 years. I had spent 34 years believing I was not wanted by a man who had written me a letter before I was born and kept track of me from a distance for 3 decades because that was the only way he'd been allowed. "Yes," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper. "Call him." Ruth stepped into the next room to make the call. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and tried to keep my breathing even. I could hear her voice, low and careful. I couldn't make out the words. I looked at the photographs on her walls. There were many of a man at various ages. A young man in what looked like the 80s, then older at different stages of a life I hadn't been part of. Dark hair going gray. A quality in his face that I was only now looking at it beginning to recognize. I looked like him. Not completely. I had my mother's eyes. But the line of the jaw, the set of the forehead, that was someone else's contribution. Someone I was seeing for the first time in these photographs. Ruth came back to the kitchen. "He's coming," she said. She sat down and looked at me with those sharp, warm eyes. "He's 20 minutes away and he's coming. I want to tell you, he was very calm on the phone. But Clara, I've known that man his entire life and he was not calm." I laughed. Surprised. It came out shaky. Ruth smiled. "You have his laugh." That stopped me completely. "I have his laugh?" "The surprised kind. When something catches you off guard." She nodded. "Exactly like that." I looked down at my mug. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Anything." "Did you hate her?" "My mother." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "For a long time I was angry," she said carefully. "I won't pretend otherwise. She took my grandchild from me. That's not a small thing." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "But I also knew Diane was not a free agent in what happened. Her father was a hard man. She was young and frightened and she made choices under pressure." She paused. "I made peace with it eventually. Not for her sake. For mine. And for James's. Carrying anger that long only hurts the person carrying it." I thought about my mother. About 34 years of a letter behind a mirror. About the weight she'd carried. "She kept the letter," I said. "I know. She never destroyed it. She kept it where she looked every morning." Ruth nodded slowly. "I think Diane Ashworth was more complicated than she let anyone see," she said. "I think she carried things she didn't know how to put down." She said something to me near the end. I stopped. She said she'd made choices. That some of them she wasn't sure about anymore. Ruth looked at me for a long moment. Then she knew, she said quietly. On some level she knew. And she left it for you. She reached over and touched the envelope. That matters. A car pulled up outside. We both heard it. Ruth stood up. She put her hand on my shoulder for a moment, just briefly, just enough, and then she went to the front door. I stayed at the kitchen table. I heard the door open. Low voices. Then footsteps. And then he was in the doorway. He was 60 years old. Taller than I'd imagined, though I don't know what I'd imagined. Dark hair gone mostly silver. My jaw. My forehead. The laugh Ruth had described, not present now but somehow visible in the structure of his face. The potential of it, the capacity for it. He stood in the doorway of his mother's kitchen and looked at me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Clara. His voice was low. Careful. Like he was handling something fragile. Hi, I said. My voice came out very small. I didn't plan it. His did. He crossed the room and sat down across the table. Not beside me, across, giving me space, letting me choose how close. Which told me something about him immediately. He looked at the letter on the table. You found it, he said. Behind the mirror. I watched his face. She kept it for 34 years. Something moved across his expression. Not surprise. More like the confirmation of a long-held hope. I wrote it because I needed her to know, he said. I needed you to know. Even if I never got to say it myself. Even if the letter sat in a drawer somewhere for 50 years. I needed the words to exist. I looked at this man who was my father. This stranger who was not entirely a stranger because I had his jaw and he had my laugh and he'd written my name in a journal since before I was born. She moved us to Vermont when I was 2, I said. He nodded. I know. I lost track for a few years. Then I found you again. I kept track from a distance. I knew when you graduated high school. I knew when you got into architecture school. He paused. I saw a photo of a building you designed about 3 years ago. There was a small article in a trade publication. I still have it. I stared at him. You knew about my work? I knew what I could find. His eyes were wet now, though his voice stayed steady. I never contacted you. I didn't think it was my right. Your mother had made her choice and I didn't want to blow up your life without an invitation. He looked at the letter. But I never stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. I grew up thinking you left, I said. That you didn't want us. I know. His voice broke slightly on those 2 words. Just slightly. I know that's what she told you. And he stopped. Collected himself. I understand why she told you that. It was easier than the truth. The truth was complicated. The truth is always complicated. Yes. He looked at me directly. But you deserved it anyway. We talked for 4 hours. Ruth made lunch at some point and we ate without really noticing. The afternoon moved around us while we sat at that kitchen table and tried to cover 34 years in the only way available. Imperfectly, incompletely, one story at a time. He told me about his life. The work he'd done. He was a civil engineer, retired now, had spent his career building infrastructure in coastal Massachusetts. He'd never married. Had come close once in his 40s but it hadn't worked out. He didn't say it like it was a tragedy. Just a fact. I told him about my life. The architecture firm. The projects I was proudest of. The apartment in Philadelphia. The way I'd always been drawn to designing spaces that felt honest. Rooms that didn't pretend to be something they weren't. He listened the way Ruth did, fully without rushing. At some point he said, "You're like her. Your mother. The way you think about things." "I know," I said. "I used to find that frustrating." "She was brilliant," he said. It wasn't defensive. Just true. She was the most intelligent person I'd ever met. She was afraid. She'd been taught to be afraid. Her father made sure of that. She was afraid her whole life," I said. "I think so." He paused. "I think keeping that letter was the bravest thing she ever did. Keeping it and not destroying it. Keeping it where she could see it." He looked at the envelope. That was her way of holding on to the truth even when she couldn't speak it. I thought about that. About a woman who'd made an impossible choice at 24 and carried the weight of it for 34 years. Who'd looked at her own reflection every morning for 3 decades with evidence of what she'd done taped to the other side of the glass. Who'd raised me with everything she had, which was considerable, even if it wasn't everything I needed. who'd made sure in the end, in the only way she could manage, that I would find the truth. "You've been a good daughter," she'd said. "Better than I deserved." She'd known what I would find. She'd left it for me on purpose. That was her apology. That was her love letter. I drove back to Vermont that evening with the letter in my bag and something new in the place where the absence had always been. Not a replacement. Nothing fills a 34-year absence completely. That's not how it works. But something. James and I exchanged numbers. He texted that evening, just, "Thank you for coming. I mean that more than I can say." I texted back, "Thank you for the letter. Even if it took 34 years to reach me." He replied, "Some letters take exactly as long as they need to." Ruth called the following Sunday. She had a warmth on the phone that I recognized from the kitchen table. The particular warmth of someone who has been waiting to love you and is simply relieved that the waiting is over. She told me James had called her 3 times since Saturday. "What did he say?" I asked. "The first time he just cried," she said. "The second time he said he didn't know what to do with himself. The third time he asked if you liked the water." "The water." "He has a boat," Ruth said. "Small thing. He takes it out in the summer. He wanted to know if you might want to come sometime." Pause. "He didn't want to ask you directly yet. He didn't want to push." I looked out my window at the Vermont winter. "Tell him yes," I said. I went back to Gloucester in July. James took me out on the boat on a Saturday morning, just the two of us, out past the harbor into open water. The sky was the kind of blue that only exists in New England summers. Particular and brilliant and not quite like any other blue. We didn't talk constantly. That was one of the things I was learning about him. He was comfortable with quiet in the way that I'd always been comfortable with quiet. Another thing we shared that I was still in the process of cataloging. At some point we anchored and ate sandwiches Ruth had made, and he told me about a bridge he'd worked on 20 years ago that he was still proud of, the way you're proud of something that outlives the context of its creation. I told him about a residential project I was designing now. A small house for a young family, nothing dramatic, but I'd spent months on the light in the main living space. The way I wanted it to fall through the west-facing windows in the late afternoon. "Why the west windows?" he asked. "Because late afternoon light is the most honest," I said. "Morning light is optimistic. Flatters everything. Late afternoon shows you things as they actually are." He looked at me. "That's exactly how I think about engineering," he said. "Not how it looks at the start. How it holds up over time." We sat with that for a moment. The water moved under the boat. The horizon was enormous and flat and very beautiful. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said. "I know. I know knowing doesn't fix it." "No," I said. "It doesn't." "Is it?" He stopped. Started again. "Is there a version of this where we figure out how to know each other? I'm not asking for everything. I know that's not possible. I'm just asking." "Yes," I said. He turned to look at me. "Yes," I said again. "There's a version. I want to try." He looked back at the water. He said. His voice was very quiet. "Okay." A year after I found the letter, I had it framed. Not the whole thing. Some of it, as I told you, is mine alone. But the last paragraph. His signature. The date. I hung it in my apartment in Philadelphia in the hallway where I see it every morning when I leave for work. I also kept the mirror. I moved it from Vermont to Philadelphia after I finished clearing the house. It hangs in my bedroom now. I look into it every morning the way my mother did for 34 years. I know it's not behind it anymore. But sometimes standing in front of it I think about her. Standing in the same place every morning with the letter on the other side of the glass. Carrying what she'd done. Carrying what had been done to her. Carrying the complicated grief of a choice made under duress at 24 that couldn't be unmade. She was not a simple woman. She was not a villain. She was a person who was frightened at a critical moment and made a choice that cost everyone something, herself included, and who spent 34 years living with the weight of it. He kept the letter. That's what I come back to. He could have burned it. She could have thrown it away any of the hundreds of times she moved it or dusted behind it or repainted that frame. He kept it. She kept it close, behind something she looked into every single day. And when she was dying, when the accounting had to be done, she made sure I would find it. That was her courage. Late, imperfect, incomplete. But real. I think about the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. The kind that operates quietly over decades, in the form of a decision not to destroy something that should survive you. My mother gave me many things: a good mind, a high tolerance for solitude, the ability to sit with complexity without needing to resolve it immediately, and at the end one more thing: the truth. Wrapped in 34 years of silence, taped to a wall behind a white-framed mirror. But mine. Finally, fully mine. If you're watching this and you have questions about your own history, about a parent, a story you were told, a door in your family that was always locked, I want to say something directly to you. The truth has a way of surviving. It survives in letters kept behind mirrors, in journals written before a child is born, in the careful, imperfect ways that people try to hold on to what was real even when they can't speak it. You may not find your truth the way I found mine. It may come differently or later or in pieces that take years to assemble. But I believe it survives. And I believe you deserve it. Not a cleaned-up version. Not the version that makes everyone look better than they were. The real one, complicated and painful and full of people who were doing the best they could with what they had, which wasn't always enough but was still theirs and still yours. Your history belongs to you. All of it. Even the parts that were hidden behind the mirror. Thank you for being here until the very end. If this story moved you, please take 1 second to like this video. It helps more people find these stories. Subscribe with the bell if you haven't already. I have more stories coming. And tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered something about your family that changed how you understood your own story? I read every single comment. Every one. Until next time, the truth is worth finding. Even when it takes 34 years.